The afternoon had been ordinary in the way cities pretend nothing is wrong. Sunlight slid across concrete. Cars passed. People walked with their heads down, minds busy with survival. And in the middle of it all stood a black woman, alone, doing nothing that should have drawn attention, except existing in a place where power liked to remind people who it belonged to. She never saw the water coming. One second she was upright. The next her body jolted as a violent stream slammed into her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. Water tore through her clothes, soaked her hair, flattened her dignity against the pavement. The pressure was merciless, playful in its cruelty, as if pain were entertainment. Laughter followed, careless, unbothered, protected by a badge and the certainty that nothing would happen next. People stopped walking, some turned away, some stared. A few raised phones but hesitated, fear mixing with guilt. This wasn't new, it was just another moment the city would swallow whole. The woman staggered but did not fall. Water streamed down her face, dripping from her fingertips, pooling at her feet like proof of humiliation. Her shoulders shook, not from weakness, but from the effort it took to remain standing when everything around her wanted her smaller, quieter, erased. She could have screamed. She could have run. She could have collapsed into exactly what was expected of her. She didn't. Instead, she lifted her head. Her eyes were steady now, clear, focused, burning with something far more dangerous than anger. The kind of calm that comes from knowing something the other side doesn't. Around her, the world held its breath, unaware that this moment had already slipped beyond control. The water stopped. The laughter faded. The officer relaxed, satisfied, certain the story would end the way it always did, with silence. But the woman reached into her soaked bag. Not in panic, not in desperation, with intention. Whatever rested inside that bag had weight, not just in her hands, but in history, in truth, in consequences long overdue. It was something earned, protected, and ready. Something that did not beg, something that did not run. What they didn't know, what he never imagined, was that this was the exact moment everything began to turn. Her name was Naomi Carter, though most people in the city didn't know it. She wasn't famous. She wasn't loud. She didn't take up space the way the world seemed to reward. Naomi had learned long ago that survival, for women like her, often meant moving carefully, being visible enough to exist, but invisible enough to stay safe. She lived in a small apartment above a closed-down laundromat, the kind of place where the walls remembered better days. Every morning she rose before the sun, tied her hair back with the same worn scarf, and stepped into a city that had taught her discipline through disappointment. Her life followed routines shaped by caution, not fear, measured steps, calm breathing, eyes always aware of exits and uniforms. Naomi carried herself with quiet dignity, but that dignity had been hard-earned. Years earlier, she had believed in systems. She had believed that truth mattered on its own, that paperwork, evidence, and patience could protect the vulnerable. That belief had cost her more than she ever expected. The details of that loss lived deep inside her, never spoken aloud, but present in the way she flinched at sirens, in the way her jaw tightened when authority demanded obedience instead of respect. The neighborhood knew her as polite, reserved, dependable, the woman who helped elders cross busy streets, the woman who volunteered without recognition, the woman who never argued, never caused scenes. But that calm exterior hid a spine made of steel, strength forged not from comfort but from endurance. The city she lived in was a place of contradictions. Shiny billboards promising progress stood over cracked sidewalks that told another story. Police cruisers rolled slowly through certain neighborhoods, not to protect, but to remind. Complaints were filed. Reports were written. Nothing ever seemed to change. And then there was Officer Daniel Hargrove. He had worn the uniform long enough to know exactly how far he could go, long enough to understand that confidence, when backed by silence, became immunity. To his superiors, he was dependable. To his peers, he was untouchable. To the community, he was a warning wrapped in authority. Hargrove didn't see people, he saw control. He moved through the streets with the comfort of someone who had never been questioned in a way that mattered. Complaints against him existed, scattered across years, buried beneath procedural language and internal reviews that led nowhere. Patterns were ignored, context erased, names forgotten. Naomi knew of him the way people in her neighborhood knew of storms before they arrived. Not from gossip, but from observation. From stories shared quietly. From looks exchanged when his patrol car slowed down. She had learned to avoid paths that crossed his orbit, not out of weakness, but because she understood something crucial: power didn't need a reason. On that day, Naomi had stepped into public space with purpose. Not defiance, not confrontation, purpose. She carried a bag that held more than everyday items. Inside, it rested fragments of her past and the weight of choices she had been postponing. She told herself she was just running an errand, just another task in a long list of obligations, but somewhere beneath that reasoning lived an instinct she could no longer ignore. The social tension around her was thick, though invisible to those who didn't need to feel it. People moved quickly, avoiding eye contact with uniforms, lowering their voices instinctively. Everyone understood the unspoken rules: comply first, question later, if ever. Justice was a word used carefully, like glass that could cut if handled wrong. Naomi had spent years learning how systems failed people who looked like her. She had watched truth shrink under pressure, watched accountability bend, watched good people give up because the cost of continuing was too high. She had almost been one of them. Almost. What no one around her knew, what even the city itself had forgotten, was that Naomi hadn't let go of everything she once believed in. She had adapted, observed, prepared. She had learned that silence could be strategic and patience could be armor. Officer Hargrove, on the other hand, believed the world was exactly as it appeared to him, a place where authority went unchallenged, where humiliation carried no consequences, where moments passed and were forgotten. Two lives moving in opposite directions, one shaped by restraint, the other by entitlement, were about to collide. And when they did, the city would be forced to witness what happens when quiet strength finally decides it has waited long enough. The moment did not announce itself. It never does. In cities like this, injustice rarely arrives with drama. It slips in quietly, disguised as procedure, masked as routine. Naomi was already being watched before she realized she had become the focus. A patrol car slowed near the curb, tires whispering against asphalt, its presence heavy even before it stopped. She felt it first in her shoulders. That familiar tightening. The instinctive awareness that came from years of learning how authority could shift the air around you. Naomi kept her pace steady, her posture calm. Her bag rested against her side, heavier than usual, not from its contents but from what it represented. She had done nothing wrong, she knew that, but knowing had never been enough. The officer stepped out with ease, the kind that came from repetition. His uniform was crisp, his movements casual, as though the street belonged to him and everyone on it was temporary. He scanned her not with curiosity, but with judgment already formed. Naomi stopped when motion was demanded of her, not because she felt obligated, but because experience had taught her that sudden movements often turned into excuses. The world narrowed around them. Traffic continued in the distance. A bus hissed as it pulled away. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. Life went on with cruel indifference, unaware it was standing at the edge of something that would not fade easily. Naomi remained composed, her face unreadable. Inside, memories stirred, file folders, courtrooms, reports stamped and dismissed. She remembered standing in places that promised fairness and delivered silence instead. She remembered learning that the tone of your voice could decide whether you went home or not. She had practiced calm the way others practiced prayer. The officer circled slightly, asserting space, asserting dominance. His presence was invasive, deliberate. People nearby slowed, pretending to check phones, pretending not to see. Fear traveled faster than sympathy in places like this. Naomi noticed the familiar pattern: attention without intervention, witnessing without responsibility. He looked bored. That bored expression was the most dangerous thing of all. It meant this wasn't about safety or law. It was about control, about reminding someone where they stood. Naomi had seen that look before, years ago, on men who enjoyed the stretch of power a little too much. Men who mistook silence for permission. Her hands remained visible, her breathing measured. The bag strap dug slightly into her shoulder. She felt the weight of eyes on her back now, felt the moment stretching longer than necessary. The officer's body language shifted, irritation flickering beneath his calm. Compliance without submission annoyed him. Calm unsettled him. Something in his demeanor hardened. The escalation came not as a burst, but as a choice. A slow, deliberate decision to turn inconvenience into spectacle. He glanced around, measuring the audience, calculating the risk. He knew the rules well enough to bend them. He knew where cameras were and where they were. He knew how stories were usually written afterward. Naomi sensed it before it happened. Her muscles tensed, not in preparation to fight, but in readiness to endure. The way people prepare for storms when there's nowhere to hide. The officer's attention shifted to a nearby utility hose, coiled against a building wall, forgotten and unattended. It was an ordinary object, meant for cleaning sidewalks, watering plants. In his hands, it became something else entirely. There was no warning. Water exploded outward with violent force, slamming into Naomi's torso and knocking the breath from her lungs. The shock was immediate, brutal. Cold water soaked through her clothes in seconds, plastering fabric to skin, stealing warmth and balance. Her feet slid against the pavement as the pressure drove her backward, not enough to knock her down, but enough to remind her how easily it could. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The officer's posture relaxed as the stream continued, steady and relentless. This wasn't restraint. It was punishment disguised as play. The water roared, drowning out thought, flattening sound, turning the moment into something primal and humiliating. Naomi's hair came loose from its tie, clinging to her face, water streaming down her neck and arms. She fought to remain upright. Her body trembled, muscles burning as she resisted the force. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to curl inward, to disappear. That instinct had saved her before, but something deeper anchored her feet to the ground, something older than fear, older than obedience. The crowd grew thicker, drawn by the spectacle. Phones appeared now, lifted cautiously, framing the scene from safe distances. No one stepped forward. No one intervened. The boundary between witnessing and complicity blurred in real time. Water pooled at Naomi's feet, spreading outward in uneven patterns. Her shoes were soaked through, socks heavy, legs numb. The pressure eased slightly, then surged again, as if testing how much she could take. The officer adjusted his stance, comfortable, entertained. And still, Naomi did not scream. Her lips parted as she gasped for air, but no sound escaped that would give him what he wanted. Her eyes, though stung and blurred by water, remained fixed forward, focused, observing, recording details the way she had been trained to do long ago. This was not chaos to her, it was data. She noticed the angle of the hose, the duration, the lack of provocation, the expressions on faces in the crowd, the phones that were finally recording. She noted the officer's ease, his lack of urgency, the casual cruelty that revealed more than anger ever could. The water finally stopped. Silence crashed in its place, heavy and disorienting. Naomi stood drenched, water dripping from her clothes in steady rhythms. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she fought to regain control of her breathing. Cold clung to her skin, seeping into her bones. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the aftermath of restraint. The officer stepped back, satisfied. He had made his point. He had turned her into a spectacle. He believed the moment would end the way so many others had, with embarrassment fading into memory, with paperwork smoothing rough edges, with the story rewritten if necessary. He believed she would gather her things and leave, grateful it hadn't been worse. Naomi did not move. The crowd waited, the city waited. Something unspoken hovered in the air, uncertain and unstable. Naomi slowly reached up and pushed wet hair from her face, her movements deliberate, controlled. Her expression was not broken, it was sharpened. Inside her bag, protected against the water by layers of careful preparation, lay the reason she had not walked away years ago. The reason she had endured silence. The reason she had chosen patience over escape. She had hoped never to need it like this. Hoped truth could remain theoretical, unused. But hope had limits. Her fingers closed around the edge of the bag's opening. The fabric was slick beneath her touch, waterlogged but intact. The weight inside felt heavier now, as if aware of its moment. Around her, people leaned forward unconsciously, sensing that something had shifted, even if they didn't yet understand what. This was no longer about humiliation. It was about exposure. Naomi inhaled deeply, steadying herself, grounding her feet against the soaked pavement. The cold no longer mattered. The stairs no longer mattered. What mattered was the line that had been crossed and the truth that had been invited in by force. The officer watched her with mild curiosity, unconcerned, unthreatened. He had no idea that the moment he chose entertainment over restraint had placed him on the wrong side of something far larger than himself. And as Naomi's hand tightened on the bag, the first half of the story came to an end, not with violence, not with chaos, but with the quiet certainty that nothing from this point forward would unfold the way it always had. Time did not move the way it usually did after that. It stretched, thinned, hovered. Naomi remained where she was, soaked and breathing, allowing the moment to settle instead of rushing past it. Water continued to drip from her sleeves and hem, each drop striking the pavement with a soft insistence that felt louder than any sound she could have made. The crowd sensed it too. This was no longer a scene that could be forgotten by turning away. The officer shifted his weight, the first sign of impatience creeping into his posture. The performance was over, and yet the woman in front of him had not reacted according to script. She had not fled. She had not crumpled. She had not given him the satisfaction of visible defeat. That unsettled him in ways he did not immediately understand. Naomi opened her bag slowly. The motion was deliberate, unhurried, as though she were aware that every second now mattered. The bag had been chosen carefully months ago, reinforced seams, water-resistant lining, a quiet preparation for a day she had prayed would never come. Her fingers brushed against the contents inside, confirming what she already knew. Nothing had been damaged. Nothing had been lost. The crowd leaned closer without realizing it. People who had once stood at a safe distance now found themselves pulled in by gravity, curiosity, and something deeper, an instinct that told them this was becoming important. Phones were fully raised now. No one pretended anymore. The story was being captured from every angle. Naomi drew out a slim, sealed folder first. It looked unremarkable, almost ordinary, but the way she held it changed the air. It was not waved. It was not brandished. It was presented with the quiet authority of someone who understands the weight of evidence. The officer's eyes followed the movement, interest sharpening into something closer to concern. She reached back into the bag. Another item emerged, smaller, reinforced, designed to survive pressure and neglect. The kind of object meant to last. Naomi's hands were steady now, her earlier trembling gone, replaced by a grounded certainty. The cold no longer registered. The humiliation had burned itself out, leaving clarity behind. This was not an act of defiance. It was an act of completion. Naomi had spent years assembling what now lay in her hands. Not all at once, not recklessly, piece by piece. Reports that had been quietly dismissed, footage that had been archived and labeled, statements from people who had been too afraid to speak publicly but not too afraid to tell the truth when given the chance. Patterns that, when viewed alone, could be ignored, but together formed something undeniable. She had never intended to be the face of it. Her work had always been behind the scenes, supporting others, strengthening cases that went nowhere, helping people understand their rights even when those rights were violated anyway. She had learned to document everything, not because she trusted the system, but because she understood how deeply it feared exposure. The officer's confidence began to fray at the edges. He scanned the crowd now not with command but calculation. Too many cameras, too many witnesses, too many unknowns. This had gone on longer than he liked, longer than was comfortable. Naomi took a step forward. The movement was small, measured, but it shifted the dynamic instantly. She was no longer simply the subject of an incident. She was an active presence. The distance between her and the officer closed just enough to make him reassess. The folder in her hand was visible now, its contents pressed against transparent covering. Names, dates, official seals, things that did not belong in the hands of someone he had just treated as disposable. Around them, murmurs spread. People began to recognize the gravity of what they were seeing, not yet understanding specifics, but sensing consequence. This was no longer about water on concrete. This was about accountability stepping into daylight. Naomi placed the items back into her bag with care, as if acknowledging that this was only the beginning. She did not need to reveal everything here. She did not need to explain. The point had already been made. The story had already escaped his control. She straightened her posture, rolling her shoulders back despite the weight of wet fabric clinging to her skin. There was no triumph in her expression. No satisfaction, only resolve, the kind that comes from knowing you have crossed a threshold and there is no benefit in looking back. The officer's demeanor changed subtly, then noticeably. His stance stiffened. The casual ease drained from his movements, replaced by rigidity. He was no longer playing to an audience. He was managing risk. The power he had wielded minutes ago now felt unstable in his grip. He took a step back. That single step did not go unnoticed. It rippled through the crowd like a signal. People shifted, whispered, reframed what they thought they were witnessing. This was not just an incident. This was a reversal in progress. Naomi's gaze never left him. She saw in that moment not a symbol, not a monster, but a man confronted with the limits of his authority. She had seen that look before, too, in courtrooms when evidence landed harder than rhetoric, in offices when excuses ran out. Fear does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like uncertainty. The city itself seemed to pause. Traffic slowed, sounds dulled. Even the air felt heavier, charged with possibility. The incident had broken free of its initial frame. It was no longer confined to a street corner or a single act of cruelty. It was expanding, becoming something larger, something that would demand answers. Naomi turned slightly, allowing the crowd a clearer view of her face. Water still traced lines down her cheeks, but there was nothing defeated in her expression. If anything, she looked lighter, unburdened by the choice she had finally made. She had carried this responsibility alone for too long. The officer's attention flicked to the devices recording him, to the witnesses who now stood firmly planted instead of drifting away. He understood optics, he understood narratives, and he understood too late that this one was no longer his to shape. Naomi did not leave immediately. She stood her ground, claiming space that had always been hers but rarely granted. The soaked pavement beneath her feet felt solid now, anchoring her to the present. Whatever happened next would happen with eyes open, with records kept, with truth unfiltered. In that stillness, the incident completed its transformation. What began as a moment of humiliation had become a point of convergence, past grievances meeting present evidence, private endurance meeting public reckoning. Naomi had not planned it this way, but she recognized it for what it was, an opening carved by arrogance and sealed by preparation. Eventually, movement resumed around them. Authorities were contacted, questions were raised. The machinery of response began to grind into motion, slow and imperfect, but unavoidable. The officer no longer laughed. The crowd no longer hesitated. And Naomi, standing at the center of it all, knew something with absolute certainty. This was no longer just her story. It belonged to everyone who had been told to endure quietly, everyone who had been soaked, silenced, dismissed, and expected to disappear. The confrontation had changed the shape of the day, the direction of the narrative, and the balance of power on that street. As she closed her bag and adjusted the strap on her shoulder, Naomi understood that whatever came next, investigations, backlash, scrutiny, would be difficult. But difficulty was familiar. What she had chosen now was truth. And once truth steps into the open, it does not go back inside quietly. The city did not explode after the incident. It did something far more dangerous. It watched. By nightfall, fragments of the moment had begun to surface across screens and whispered conversations. Short clips, cropped angles, frozen frames of water midair, and a woman standing where she should not have been standing anymore. The footage spread unevenly, stitched together by curiosity rather than context. Some posts vanished quickly. Others multiplied faster than anyone expected. Algorithms did what they always did, circulated pain before understanding it. Naomi did not watch any of it. She returned home with clothes still damp and muscles aching, climbing the narrow stairs to her apartment as if each step were heavier than the last. The familiar creak of the door closing behind her felt louder than usual, sealing her inside a space that suddenly felt much smaller. She set the bag down carefully, as though it carried something fragile, though she knew the fragility was not in the contents. She stood still for a long moment. Then she exhaled. The quiet of the room pressed in, broken only by the low hum of the city outside. Sirens in the distance, footsteps below, life continuing without permission. Naomi removed her soaked jacket and laid it across a chair, watching water drip onto the floor in slow, patient drops. Each one felt like a punctuation mark, marking the end of something she had lived with for years. The choice had been made. She had crossed a line she could not uncross, and with it came a familiar weight, anticipation mixed with dread. Naomi had seen what happened to people who forced systems to look at themselves. Retaliation rarely came loudly. It came quietly, administratively, through delays and discrediting and isolation. She had prepared for that too. Inside her bag, sealed and protected, were duplicates of everything she had shown. Copies existed elsewhere, stored with people she trusted, and some she barely knew, all bound by one understanding. If anything happened to her, the truth would not disappear with her. That had been the real work all along, not collecting evidence, but making it impossible to bury. By morning, the tone shifted. Local outlets picked up the story cautiously, framing it with conditional language and official statements that arrived suspiciously fast. Words like incident, misunderstanding, and under review floated through headlines. The officer's name appeared and disappeared depending on the source. Naomi's name was harder to find. When it did appear, it was often misspelled or stripped of detail, reduced to a silhouette of victimhood. She noticed. Naomi read everything with the practiced eye of someone who understood narrative manipulation. She saw which details were emphasized and which were quietly omitted. The water was mentioned. The hose was mentioned. The lack of provocation was softened into ambiguity. Authority was protected by distance. By noon, unofficial voices were louder than official ones. Community members shared longer videos, uncut angles, slow-motion breakdowns. Patterns emerged in comment sections as strangers compared stories, recognizing familiar behavior in unfamiliar faces. Names surfaced, dates, locations. The incident began to connect itself to others like it, forming a thread too thick to ignore. Pressure built. The department issued a statement promising transparency while advising patience. An internal review was announced. The language was polished, designed to soothe rather than answer. Officer Hargrove was placed on temporary administrative leave, a phrase Naomi had learned translated to wait and see. For him, the world narrowed. The uniform that once felt like armor now felt like exposure. His name circulated in places he could not control, attached to footage he could not explain away. The confidence that had carried him through years of unchallenged authority cracked under scrutiny. Every knock, every notification, every glance felt accusatory. He began to realize something essential had changed. This was not one complaint, not one moment. It was a convergence. The past he believed safely buried was resurfacing, organized and contextualized by someone who understood how systems worked and how they failed. Naomi remained largely unseen during those first days. She moved through her routine quietly, though the routine itself had shifted. Calls came in, some supportive, some probing, some openly hostile. Messages piled up from people who had found her name through breadcrumbs left online. Some thanked her. Others warned her. A few tried to scare her back into silence. She documented everything. The emotional toll was heavier than she admitted even to herself. Nights stretched long as sleep came in fragments. She replayed the incident not out of regret but assessment. Could she have left sooner? Should she have waited longer? The questions arrived uninvited, but she met them with resolve. Doubt was a luxury she could no longer afford. In the community, something fragile stirred. People gathered in small groups, talking openly in ways they hadn't before. The incident had cracked something open, not hope exactly, but possibility. That possibility made institutions nervous. It made authority defensive. It made truth dangerous again. Behind closed doors, strategies formed. Legal teams reviewed footage frame by frame. Spokespeople rehearsed statements. Timelines were adjusted. The goal was containment, not justice, containment. Naomi understood that too well. She had spent years watching how truth was diluted through process until it lost its potency. But this time, containment was harder. The evidence was not isolated. It was layered, structured, prepared by someone who had anticipated every counterargument before it was spoken. Naomi had not acted impulsively. She had acted deliberately, and that deliberation now forced the system to slow down and look. Officer Hargrove felt the ground shifting beneath him. Colleagues kept their distance, some out of fear, others out of calculation. The informal protection he once enjoyed thinned as attention intensified. He realized the laughter from that afternoon had followed him, replayed endlessly without context or control. Moments he had dismissed as insignificant now defined him. For the first time, he felt watched. Naomi felt it too, but differently. She felt the gaze of expectation, of people projecting their hopes and grievances onto her shoulders. It was heavy, uncomfortable, and deeply human. She resisted the urge to step forward publicly. Not yet. Timing mattered. Truth required space to breathe before it could land. The city waited, suspended between denial and reckoning. And in that waiting, the weight of truth pressed down on everyone involved. On the officer who had mistaken power for permanence, on the institutions scrambling to protect themselves, and on a woman who had finally allowed her preparation to meet its moment. This was only the beginning. The days that followed did not bring relief. They brought structure. Meetings were scheduled behind sealed doors. Emails were drafted and redrafted, each word weighed for liability rather than truth. The city's rhythm changed subtly, like a river encountering resistance beneath the surface. People sensed it. They adjusted their conversations, lowered voices, chose sides without announcing them. Naomi felt the shift most acutely when she stepped outside. Eyes lingered longer now. Some carried gratitude, others carried suspicion. A few carried resentment, as if she had disturbed an order that benefited them by staying intact. She kept her head high and her pace steady, refusing to shrink under attention she had not sought but had earned. Requests began to arrive from advocacy groups and attorneys who had followed her work quietly for years. They did not promise miracles. They promised process. Naomi listened without committing, measuring intentions the way she always had. She understood that allies sometimes arrived late and that timing mattered as much as sincerity. Across town, Officer Hargrove's isolation deepened. The administrative leave that was supposed to be routine stretched into days, then weeks. Silence from supervisors replaced the familiar banter. He watched coverage he once ignored, studying his own posture on repeat, looking for angles that might save him. Each replay stripped away another layer of certainty. Internal Affairs requested materials. He complied with the confidence of habit, but that confidence frayed when follow-up questions came quickly and without reassurance. The past no longer felt distant. It felt organized. Someone had done their homework, and that someone had anticipated the defenses he relied on. Naomi spent evenings reviewing timelines, aligning her records with the footage circulating online. She noticed how narratives attempted to drift, how commentators tried to recenter the story on procedure rather than impact. She corrected nothing publicly. She documented everything privately. Precision was her shield. The community organized without naming her as a leader. That mattered to her. Candlelight vigils formed at the site of the incident, not as spectacle but as witness. People stood in silence, holding space rather than slogans. It unsettled officials more than noise ever could. Pressure reached City Hall. Council members issued statements calling for calm while demanding answers. Committees announced hearings. The machinery of accountability, long rusted, began to grind with a reluctant whir. Each movement produced friction, heat, and resistance. Hargrove's attorneys shifted strategy. What had begun as minimization turned toward character scrutiny. Old associations were examined, rumors were amplified. The goal was familiar, blur the subject until clarity dissolved. Naomi expected it. She had prepared counters and contingencies, each grounded in documentation rather than outrage. She met with a small circle of trusted professionals in a borrowed office late one night. They reviewed options, risks, and timelines. No one spoke of victory, they spoke of endurance. Naomi left with a folder thinner than her bag but heavier in consequence. Sleep came unevenly. When it did, it carried fragments of memory and anticipation. She woke before dawn most days, steadying herself with routine, coffee, notes, breathing. She reminded herself that fear could coexist with resolve without negating it. Media requests intensified. She declined most, choosing a single outlet known for restraint and accuracy. The decision was strategic, not timid. One clear account would do more than a dozen reactive appearances. She prepared meticulously, framing facts with context and refusing sensationalism. The interview aired and changed the temperature. Viewers saw not a caricature but a composed woman grounded in evidence. The absence of theatrics sharpened the impact. Calls surged again, this time from people who recognized their own stories in hers. Institutions responded predictably. A new statement promised reform. A task force was announced. Training was emphasized. Naomi noted the language and its omissions. Reform without accountability was rehearsal, not change. Behind the scenes, additional records surfaced. Whistleblowers found courage in numbers. A pattern solidified, no longer deniable as coincidence. Hargrove's name appeared alongside others, linked by behavior and protection. The story widened beyond one street corner. For Hargrove, the walls closed in. Depositions loomed. His certainty collapsed into calculation. He considered apologies he had never practiced, explanations he had never needed. Power, once effortless, now demanded negotiation. Naomi felt the weight of representation pressing harder. She resisted being positioned as exception or savior. She redirected attention to systems, insisting that no single act explained a pattern. The work was not to elevate her, but to illuminate structures that thrived in shadow. As hearings approached, the city braced itself. Security plans were drafted, schedules adjusted. The incident had become a mirror forcing reflection whether welcomed or not. Some looked away, Others leaned closer. On the eve of testimony, Naomi reviewed her materials one last time. She checked seals, timestamps, redundancies. She packed her bag with care, the same bag that had carried preparation into daylight. It felt lighter now, emptied of secrecy. Outside, the city breathed, unaware of the precise moment it would be asked to listen. Naomi stood at her window and watched lights flicker on and off across the skyline. She felt tired. She felt ready. The additions arrived methodically, like ledger entries rather than revelations. Subpoenas were issued and answered. Calendars filled with dates that could no longer be postponed. Each procedural step, dull on its own, accumulated into momentum. Naomi understood momentum. It was the difference between being heard and being archived. She noticed changes in everyday interactions. Store clerks lingered with a quiet nod. Neighbors asked if she needed anything and meant it. Others avoided her altogether, unwilling to be associated with a challenge to order. Both reactions confirmed the same truth. Neutrality had evaporated. Preparation extended beyond documents. Naomi arranged contingencies for work, transportation, and safety. She shared itineraries with trusted contacts and rotated routines without announcing them. Caution was not paranoia. It was practice refined by experience. The aim was continuity, not fear. Opposition grew louder as clarity sharpened. Commentators framed the issue as divisive. Anonymous accounts questioned motives. Familiar tactics resurfaced, dusted off, and deployed with urgency. Naomi tracked them without engaging, allowing patterns to expose intent. At the department, morale faltered. Training sessions were rescheduled. Supervisors issued reminders about conduct that sounded rehearsed. Officers watched one another with new wariness, uncertain who might speak next. Accountability, once abstract, had entered the room. Hargrove's nights lengthened. He rehearsed narratives that no longer fit the facts. The evidence did not argue back, it simply existed. That was its power. He felt it closing around him, patient and precise, indifferent to persuasion. Community leaders coordinated transportation for hearings and shared summaries for those who could not attend. They emphasized presence over protest, understanding that quiet rooms could be as consequential as loud streets. Naomi appreciated the restraint. It mirrored her own. When preliminary findings leaked, they did so without drama. A confirmation here, a contradiction there. Enough to signal direction without satisfying curiosity. The city's appetite sharpened, so did its patience. Naomi spent an afternoon organizing personal effects, a small ritual that grounded her. She labeled folders, archived emails, and cleared space on her desk. Order calmed the noise. It reminded her that control could be exercised without domination. As the date approached, weather forecasts predicted rain. Naomi noted it without superstition. She had learned not to read omens into logistics. What mattered was readiness, not symbolism. The final briefings emphasized consistency. Facts would be presented once clearly and left to stand. Naomi practiced breathing and posture, not lines. She trusted preparation more than performance. On the morning itself, she rose before dawn again. The city felt taut like a held breath. She packed the bag and checked it twice. Then she paused, recognizing the quiet significance of repetition. The bag had carried weight into the open. Now it would carry resolve into record. She stepped outside as the sky lightened, aware that whatever followed would extend beyond her. The rising action had done its work. The stage was set not by spectacle but by accumulation. Truth, finally aligned, waited to be spoken. She felt the presence of those who could not attend but were invested all the same, their hopes threaded through messages and quiet gestures. That collective weight steadied her. It reminded her that accountability was communal labor, not a solo performance. The approach to the building was orderly. Lines moved. Security procedures unfolded without incident. Naomi observed details without attaching meaning, conserving energy for what mattered. She took her seat and placed the bag at her feet, hands resting easily, breath even. Around her, notebooks opened. Pens hovered, screens glowed. The room held a seriousness that discouraged theatrics. It favored evidence. Naomi recognized the terrain and welcomed it. As proceedings commenced, she felt neither vindication nor fear. She felt alignment. Years of preparation, patience, and restraint converged into a single direction. The rising action had carried everyone here not to spectacle but to reckoning. Outside, rain began to fall, light and steady. Inside, attention focused. The story, once scattered, gathered itself into record. Whatever came next would be shaped by what had already been assembled. That knowledge anchored her, quiet and unshakable. She adjusted her posture and waited, understanding that waiting, too, could be an action when grounded in purpose. The weight of truth no longer pressed solely on her shoulders. It distributed itself across the room, the city, the systems that had delayed it. In that distribution lived a fragile fairness. Naomi held to it, knowing momentum had already shifted, knowing the work ahead would be measured and difficult, and knowing that this moment marked the end of avoidance and the beginning of accountability that would reshape choices, language, memory, and responsibility for those who once believed time alone could erase consequence permanently. The room carried a gravity that could not be manufactured. It was not the kind that came from ceremony or authority, but the kind that formed when evidence and attention occupied the same space. People sat straighter. Pens paused midair. Screens glowed with documents that refused to be ignored. The city had assembled itself into a single posture, listening. Naomi entered the moment without spectacle. She did not arrive as a symbol or a spectacle of resilience. She arrived as a record keeper. Years of restraint had trained her for this exact posture, back straight, hands steady, breath even. The bag rested at her feet, no longer heavy with secrecy but anchored by purpose. Everything she had protected now stood ready to stand on its own. The proceedings unfolded with methodical precision. Timelines aligned. Footage played uninterrupted, its continuity doing what outrage could not. The water surged again on the screen, but this time it was framed by context rather than chaos. Angles overlapped. Durations were measured. Absence of provocation was established not by assertion, but by accumulation. Each piece clicked into place with quiet inevitability. The officer's presence registered differently now. He was no longer insulated by familiarity or routine. He was a subject of record, his movements parsed and compared against policy he had once treated as suggestion. The uniform that had conveyed ease now seemed constricting, its symbolism reversed by scrutiny. The room did not react theatrically. It absorbed. Naomi's materials were introduced with care, not dumped, not dramatized, organized, labeled, cross-referenced. Patterns emerged that could not be attributed to coincidence without willful blindness. Incidents once dismissed as isolated gained proximity, then shape. The narrative tightened around facts that had waited patiently for alignment. As the record grew, so did its reach. What had begun as a single act expanded into a constellation of corroboration. Witness accounts matched timestamps, reports mirrored footage. Discrepancies fell away under the weight of consistency. The system, long practiced at deflection, found fewer places to hide. The shift became visible in posture before it appeared in words. Officials leaned forward. Reviewers requested clarifications they already knew would arrive intact. The pace slowed, not from uncertainty, but from care. This was the moment when haste would undermine credibility. Precision mattered more than speed. Naomi felt the convergence without claiming ownership of it. She had not created the truth, she had curated its path to daylight. The distinction mattered. It allowed the facts to carry themselves, free of embellishment. The absence of performance sharpened the impact, leaving little room for dismissal. Outside the room, the city reacted in waves. Updates rippled through networks, stripped of speculation by the clarity of record. The public did not need persuasion when shown continuity. Trust, once eroded, did not return easily, but attention did. Attention lingered, focused, and difficult to redirect. The officer's defenses narrowed to technicalities. Procedures were cited, interpretations offered, but the cumulative effect resisted dilution. Each explanation addressed a fragment while the whole remained intact. The mismatch became the point. The system had prepared for argument, not for alignment. As the evidence closed its loop, a quiet recalibration occurred. Accountability stopped being abstract. It became specific. Names, dates, actions. The threshold crossed was not emotional, it was procedural, and procedures once engaged honestly have momentum. Naomi registered the moment not as triumph, but as release. The tension she had carried for years loosened its grip, replaced by a steadier weight, responsibility shared. She felt it distribute across the room, across institutions forced into coherence by documentation. The work had outgrown her as it needed to. When the findings were articulated, they landed without flourish. The words were measured, careful, irreversible. They acknowledged failure where failure existed. They outlined consequences not as punishment, but as correction. The clarity of the language denied escape routes built on ambiguity. The officer's posture changed again, subtly and finally. Calculation gave way to recognition. The room no longer revolved around his certainty. It revolved around record. The difference was decisive. Authority shifted from assumption to accountability, from habit to consequence. The turning point crystallized not in a gasp, but in stillness. The kind that follows inevitability. People wrote less, listened more. The proceedings reached a hinge, and everyone present felt the weight of crossing it. Naomi's role concluded without ceremony. She did not seek acknowledgement, and none was required. Her materials had spoken with a clarity she could not improve upon. She gathered herself, grounded by the knowledge that preparation had met its moment without distortion. Beyond the room, institutions responded with an urgency they had long postponed. Reviews expanded. Oversight mechanisms activated. Policies were revisited with an attention previously reserved for crises that could not be ignored. The city's machinery, resistant but responsive, adjusted course under pressure it could not deflect. For the community, the climax reframed possibility, not as instant transformation but as proof of leverage. Evidence could bend systems when assembled with care. Silence could be strategic until it was time to speak. The lesson traveled quickly, carried by example rather than slogan. As the session concluded, the air felt lighter without becoming celebratory. Resolution had not arrived, direction had. The distinction mattered. It promised work ahead without erasing the cost already paid. Naomi stepped into the corridor and paused, letting the moment pass through her without rushing it away. She felt tired in a way that signaled completion rather than depletion. The bag rested easily now, emptied of secrecy, full of purpose fulfilled. Outside, the city resumed its sound. Traffic moved, people crossed streets. Life continued, altered in small but meaningful ways by a record that refused erasure. The climax did not end the story, it anchored it. And in that anchoring, the balance shifted. Not dramatically, not permanently, but enough to change behavior, language, and expectation. Enough to make begging unnecessary and accountability unavoidable. Enough to prove that truth, when prepared and presented without fear, can still force power to kneel, not in humiliation, but in recognition of its limits. The days that followed did not feel like an ending. They felt like an adjustment, slow, uneven, and deeply human. The city did not suddenly become just, nor did old wounds vanish because one truth had been acknowledged. What changed instead was subtler, more durable. The direction of attention had shifted, and with it, the rules of engagement. Official actions unfolded in stages. Administrative conclusions hardened into formal consequences. Reviews expanded beyond the original incident, widening their scope to include patterns that could no longer be dismissed as anomalies. Oversight committees convened with an urgency born not of goodwill, but of necessity. Accountability had entered the room, and it refused to leave quietly. Officer Hargrove's authority dissolved not in spectacle, but in process. The uniform that once insulated him now marked him for scrutiny. The protections he had taken for granted thinned under the weight of documentation that spoke without malice or exaggeration. Consequences arrived measured and procedural, stripped of drama, grounded in record. It was not vengeance, it was correction. For Naomi, the immediate aftermath was strangely quiet. She returned to her routines with intention, grounding herself in the familiar to counterbalance the extraordinary. Morning light filtered through her apartment windows the same way it always had. The city sounded no different at dawn, but she felt different moving through it, no longer braced for invisibility, no longer burdened by secrecy. The bag rested by her door, lighter now, its purpose fulfilled. She did not rush to replace it with another symbol. Symbols had their place, but she had learned that change endured through structure, not ornament. She organized her files, archived correspondence, and closed loops that had remained open for years. Completion, she discovered, was its own kind of relief. Community responses matured from reaction into reflection. Vigils gave way to workshops. Conversations deepened, shifting from outrage to understanding. People asked better questions. They listened longer. The incident became a reference point, not a spectacle, an example of how power could be confronted without losing humanity. Naomi resisted invitations to become a figurehead. She declined accolades that flattened complexity into praise. She redirected attention to collectives, to systems, to the quiet labor that sustained accountability when headlines moved on. Recognition mattered less to her than continuity. The work was not finished because one moment had been addressed. Institutions under sustained attention began to recalibrate. Training modules were revised with specificity rather than generality. Reporting mechanisms gained clarity and protection. Transparency measures were strengthened, not out of sudden virtue, but because opacity had proven costly. The changes were imperfect, but they were tangible. They existed in writing, in schedules, in budgets. That mattered. Naomi accepted a role that allowed her to contribute without spectacle. Advisory, behind the scenes, precise. She brought with her a discipline forged by patience and documentation, insisting on metrics over promises. Her presence altered rooms not by volume but by expectation. She asked for timelines. She asked for follow-through. She asked for proof. The city's relationship with authority shifted incrementally. Trust did not surge, it recalibrated. Skepticism remained, but it sharpened into engagement rather than withdrawal. People understood that accountability was not a mood, it was a practice. It required persistence, collaboration, and the willingness to be unglamorous. For Naomi, healing did not arrive as catharsis. It arrived as steadiness. Sleep returned in longer stretches. The reflexive tightening at sirens softened. She found herself lingering in public spaces without scanning exits first. A small freedom she had forgotten was possible. The memory of water against her skin remained, but it no longer defined her posture. It existed as context, not command. She revisited old notes, not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge distance traveled. What once felt like solitary labor now felt connected, validated by outcomes that extended beyond her own safety. The years of preparation no longer seemed excessive. They seemed necessary. Relationships shifted too. Some grew closer, strengthened by shared effort. Others faded, unable to adapt to a world where silence no longer served comfort. Naomi let those changes stand without resentment. Alignment mattered more than familiarity. The officer's story receded from public focus, as such stories often do. Consequences continued privately, shaping a future constrained by record rather than assumption. Naomi did not track it closely. Her work was not sustained by watching someone fall, but by ensuring others did not. As months passed, the incident settled into institutional memory. It became cited in policy reviews, referenced in trainings, and taught as a case study in what documentation could achieve. That endurance mattered. It meant the moment would not evaporate when attention shifted. Naomi found meaning in that endurance. She volunteered less and advised more. She mentored quietly, teaching others how to document without bitterness, how to prepare without despair. She emphasized care alongside rigor, reminding them that sustainability required rest as much as resistance. The city remained complicated. Progress did not arrive evenly. Setbacks occurred. But the line had moved. The threshold of acceptable behavior narrowed. The expectation of consequence sharpened. Those shifts, modest as they were, carried weight. One evening, Naomi returned to the square where it had happened. The pavement was dry, the building unchanged. People passed through without noticing her. She stood for a moment, breathing evenly, feeling the distance between then and now. It did not feel triumphant. It felt resolved. She turned away without ceremony, carrying nothing but the knowledge that preparation, when paired with courage, could still alter outcomes. The resolution was not perfect, but it was real. And in that reality lived the quiet promise that dignity, once defended with care, could outlast cruelty and reshape what came next. This story was never just about water sprayed from a hose. It was about power used carelessly and dignity tested publicly. It was about how easily cruelty hides behind routine and how often silence is mistaken for weakness. Naomi did not win because she was louder. She did not win because someone rescued her. She did not win because the system suddenly grew a conscience. She stood because she had prepared. The real lesson is this: injustice depends on people believing nothing will change. It survives on the idea that endurance is the same as surrender, and that those who are harmed will eventually disappear quietly. But truth does not disappear when it is documented, protected, and shared with intention. It waits. Power fears exposure more than anger. It fears patience more than noise. It fears records more than resistance. Naomi's strength was not found in confrontation alone, but in years of unseen labor, learning, documenting, waiting for the right moment. Her calm was not compliance. It was strategy. Her silence was not submission. It was preparation. This story reminds us that justice is rarely instant and never effortless. It is built slowly, often by people who do not seek recognition but refuse erasure. It asks for courage that lasts longer than outrage and commitment that survives when attention fades. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that dignity is not something authority grants. It is something no one has the right to take away. When power forgets its limits, truth has a way of reminding it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes their voice doesn't matter. Because sometimes, the quietest people carry the strongest proof.